So we have basically a couple of things to talk about. The hormones of zona fasciculata, glucocorticoids, and hormones of zona reticularis, the androgens. Now, zona fasciculata is the middle one. It's pretty big. And it produces glucocorticoids. If you don't mind, I'm not going to use glucocorticoids anymore. I'm just going to say cortisol. Much easier. There are many of them. Cortisol, cortisone, hydrocortisone. I'm going to refer to cortisol because they all elicit basically the same effects. Cortisol is released in response to stress. You may think, wait a minute, what about epinephrine, norepinephrine? Well, that sympathetic activation is kind of an acute response. When you, when you are in the dangerous situation on the road, you have that heart rate going up, blood pressure spiking, flushing to the face. That's epinephrine, norepinephrine system. That's your sympathetic response. When you have long-term stress, you're really sick and you're in the hospital. You have troubles, whatever these troubles are. Work, with kids, you stress. You will start producing cortisol. And I refer to emotional stress. Now, it's not only emotional stress, it can be sometimes physiological stress. I should correct myself. For instance, it was shown that if you put take mice and subject them to stress of hypokinesia, take a mouse, stick it in a tube so it can't move. Its cortisol levels over time will increase. Does that make sense? So here how it goes. That's the typical nervous stimulation. Stress is perceived emotionally, right, by the limbic system. What you consider as a stress, I may not, and vice versa. So whatever you consider as a stress, those nerve signals reach hypothalamus, and hypothalamus produces CRH. Okay? CRH stands for corticotropin releasing hormone. So again, we have hypothalamus that produces CRH. Corticotropin releasing hormone travels through the portal system, acts on the anterior pituitary, which in turn produces, now, corticotropin releasing, meaning that the next hormone will be corticotropin. The different name for it is adrenocorticotropic hormone. Now, it's one word. The way I put it, just to save some space, okay? It's one long word. Adrenocorticotropic hormone, or ACTH. Sorry, we do it differently here, right? ACTH. ACTH acts on the adrenal cortex, which releases what? Cortisol. Does that make sense? Now, what are the effects of the cortisol? They do not relieve your psychological stress, first and foremost. No, they do not. But they trigger the responses that help you to overcome, help you to cope with the stress. To cope with the stress, you need a lot of energy, okay? So, glucocorticoids, cortisol namely, will stimulate synthesis of glucose, so-called gluconeogenesis. Can you see that? We'll have glucose as the energy source. Am I clear? Now, if you're stressed, like if you're in a tough situation, you can't rely on the food that comes from the outside. So your protein will start to get broken down, will start to get catabolized. Cortisol is catabolic hormone, protein mobilization, breakdown of proteins. So proteins and fats converted to glucose. Okay? And as we just mentioned, proteins and fats. Okay? So fat will be mobilized as well. Now let's see, it's all fancy words, let's see what kind of effect it's going to have on your overall functioning. First, since cortisol stimulates protein mobilization and protein breakdown, when you're really stressed, will you be able to gain any muscle? Probably not. Since it mobilizes lipids, what's going to happen to your lipid storage? Mobilizes, uses lipids, breaks down lipids. They're going to decrease. And that's probably the only good outcome of the stress. I know N equals 1, not enough data, but I had once really stressful situation in my life for about half a year. I lost 1 or 2 sizes in my pants. Okay? And I barely ate. Okay, so it really helps. Stress often reduces your food intake, but we'll get to food intake later. So far, does that make sense? Now, what's going to happen to your glucose levels in the blood during the stress? If glucose is synthesized from scratch, yes, they're going to go up. And this is a very interesting consequence. Often, cortisol, if it's produced at the elevated levels for a long period of time, may lead to constantly elevated blood glucose, which leads to what disease? Diabetes. Yes. Does that make sense? So if I ask you about metabolic effects of any hormone, but let's use cortisol as an example. If I ask you in the lab, in the quiz, in the exam, what are the metabolic effects of cortisol? I mean that it's elevated blood glucose or elevated, glucose synthesis, lipolysis or breakdown of fat, and breakdown of protein. If I would ask the same question about growth hormone, you would tell me growth hormone increases metabolically. It increases blood glucose and it increases blood lipids by breaking down fat. But growth hormone metabolically increases protein synthesis. This guy doesn't increase protein synthesis, it does exactly the opposite. Does that make sense? So again, blood glucose goes up, proteins got broken down for energy, lipids got broken down for energy. Are we clear about that? Remember I told you about high blood pressure. When ACTH here acts on the adrenal cortex, it stimulates sodium retention by stimulating which hormone that we just talked about? Aldosterone. It's kind of a collateral damage. It's sort of in a collateral way stimulates aldosterone release, which increases sodium retention, water retention, blood pressure goes up. Does that make sense? What is the negative feedback? Cortisol inhibits anterior pituitary gland and inhibits hypothalamus. So again, this modeling thing. If I would take cortisol and we'll start injecting a patient with a bunch of cortisol, what's going to happen to ACTH and CRH levels? Huh? I can't hear. Increase? Decrease. That's why I'm saying I can't hear you. Speak up. Decrease. If I somehow remove all cortisol from a patient, magically, what's going to happen to CRH and ACTH levels? It's going to go up. Is that clear? Cool. Now, I'm going to introduce these terms to you right now, and I give you a fair warning that you must know these terms for the rest of the semester. So, when cortisol is produced, this is what it increases. It increases gluconeogenesis. Let's break this word down. Gluco refers to which molecule? Glucose. Neo refers to what term? Which adjective? Neo? New. Genesis? Make. So making glucose anew from scratch. Does that make sense? Gluconeogenesis. Making glucose from scratch. Glycogenolysis. Two parts. Glycogen and lysis. So, I'm not even going to ask you. So, glycogenolysis is breakdown of glycogen. Is that clear? And remember, glycogen is the glucose storage molecule. Does that make sense to you? So, both synthesizing glucose from scratch and breaking down the molecule that stores the glucose leads to elevated blood glucose. That make sense? We clear? Any questions about this? Another term, lipolysis. Breakdown of fat for energy. For proteins, we don't really have a specific term. We call it protein catabolism. Am I clear? Huh? Good. Excellent. Well, what it decreases? Protein synthesis. You can't break down proteins and synthesize them at the same time. Am I clear? Lipogenesis. You can't break down fats and synthesize them at the same time. And glycolysis. Can anyone tell me what is glycolysis? Breaking down of sugar. First step of sugar breakdown in the process of cellular respiration, right? So, if you are making sugar, you're not breaking it down. Does it make sense? Are we clear? With this, when I ask you a question, which of the following effects will be observed when cortisol levels are elevated? I'm going to be using smart words like glycolysis, glycogenolysis, gluconeogenesis, lipolysis, lipogenesis. Bless you. And I don't want to sound rude, but I expect you to know what they mean. So if you come to me during the exam and say, can you explain what glycolysis is? I won't. You clear? Because when we're going to be talking about insulin and glucagon, these terms appear again. You have enough time to, memorize them and remember what they mean. So far, we good? Was clear? Cortisol also suppresses the immune response and inflammation. So we use different cortisol derivatives like hydrocortisone or fluticasone to treat various inflammatory conditions. So fluticasone, person with allergy, nose, is great to treat runny nose, allergic rhinitis. We use hydrocortisone cream to treat inflammatory skin conditions like eczema. Okay? Now, we all know that cortisol is lipid soluble, so all the same mechanism. Here's the cortisol, binds to the cytoplasmic receptor, binds to the DNA, transcription, translation, lot proteins. We're clear about that? So this just shows you the concentration of corticosterone in rats after they are subjected to stress. You see that it rises pretty rapidly. Okay? We're talking about the matter of minutes. Rats develop stress response mediated by corticosteroids. Any questions so far? Clinical considerations. What if you make, well, first of all, you can treat diseases, inflammatory diseases, autoimmune diseases with corticosteroids. There are some conditions like tennis elbow, plantar fasciitis that are often treated with the injections, local injections of corticosteroids because they have very potent anti-inflammatory effect. What if somebody makes too much? Overproduction. Let me go back for a second. I'm going to erase this. If cortisol levels are increased, whether artificially by constantly taking corticosteroids or due to some unfortunate event, what's going to happen to the blood glucose? It's going to go up, and it's going to stay up all the time. And it's interesting that at some point, that elevated blood glucose will overcome lipolysis. You have to understand that body doesn't work this or that. Like when I told you, if we break down lipids, we're not making lipids. No, we do. But lipolysis is much more intense than lipogenesis in case of stress. Does that make sense? But at some point when blood glucose levels are really high, all these extra calories start to get deposited as fat. So people with so-called Cushing's disease, overproduction of cortisol will demonstrate significant obesity, and the deposition of fat is really interesting. It is deposited in the back of the neck. It's called buffalo hump, and it also leads to what's called moon face. Fat gets deposited in the face. Face becomes, it looks like a little bit swollen. Okay, that's one. Now, what if there's a deficit? What if somebody doesn't produce enough corticosteroids? In this case, hypertension. Turns out skin darkening. Corticosteroids are really important in regulating melanin production. Will lead to fatigue because there's not enough sugar in the blood. Makes sense, right? Muscles are not going to be able to work just as well because not enough glycogen is stored. John Fitzgerald Kennedy actually had Addison's disease, underproduction of corticosteroids. And this photograph of JFK is made before he started treatment with glucocorticoids. So even in that photo, that is black and white, you can see that he's kind of has a darker than usual skin. He's kind of skinny. You can't say if he's fatigued, but he was. After he started treatment, that's him. Looks much better, more healthy. That makes sense. So these conditions are pretty common. Now, the last hormone of adrenal gland that I wanted to talk about today is, it's actually a group of hormones called androgens. So hormones of zona reticularis play kind of supportive role to gonadal androgens, meaning supportive role to testosterone and estrogen. Okay, they're produced in really small amounts, and the function in men is unknown because in men, levels of testosterone, although they do decrease throughout life. They do not decrease dramatically like in women after the menopause. Does that make sense? So technically speaking, these androgens in men really aren't needed. However, in women, before menopause, they may be responsible for the sex drive, specifically testosterone, and in post-menopausal women, androgens that are produced by adrenal cortex serve as the main source of estrogen. But again, amounts are low. That makes sense? So they do not substitute for the decreased levels of estrogen after the menopause. We clear? Does that make sense to you? This nod. Like a nod, okay. Now, one of the most physiologically fascinating conditions is adrenogenital or androgenital syndrome. So now, remember we just talked about the axis, this hypothalamus pituitary adrenal axis. Now, 1 second. What if glucocorticoids, cortisol, isn't produced at all, like nil? What's going to happen to the levels of ACTH and CRH? They're going to increase, specifically ACTH. It's going to skyrocket. So increased ACTH will stimulate adrenal cortex. But remember, this adrenal cortex is dysfunctional. It can't produce cortisol. Do I make sense so far? So it cannot produce any cortisol in response to ACTH, but it will try to compensate for it by growing bigger and bigger. Does that make sense? And when it grows bigger and bigger, it produces more and more testosterone-like androgens. Do I make sense? So zona fasciculata is dysfunctional, but zona reticularis works just fine, and it keeps producing testosterone. So what it does, it leads to masculinization in females. Not complete, but for instance, facial and body hair, yes, absolutely. Now what about males? In males, it leads to formation of so-called ambiguous external genitalia. This is called hypospadia. When it's a newborn, in a newborn, they're basically underdeveloped penis and very poorly developed vagina. This condition can be surgically corrected. It's not really a big problem, and eventually, it's going to be a boy. But people with that condition have to take oral glucocorticoids, because when they take glucocorticoids, levels of ACTH and CRH go down, right? And the condition becomes better. Before we kind of conclude, any questions? We're all good?